The cold wind of the North Sea rips at the sails, soaked with salt and blood. Warriors with stiff, tangled braids stand shoulder to shoulder. Their hair streams like flame above steel. Why then did these people who lived for battle not cut their hair like the Romans or Saxons? Why did every Viking consider long strands a part of their strength? A question whose answer is hidden deeper than it seems, in the very culture of war, honor, and the fear of death. And if you listen to the end, you will learn that their hair was not an adornment, but a weapon, real and symbolic. The first written mentions of long-haired Scandinavians date back to the records of the Anglo-Saxon chronicles of the 9th century. English monks, describing the Northerners, described them as people with the manes of beasts. Archaeologists found combs made of bone, carved scissors, and even bronze mirrors in every second warrior burial. This was not a coincidence. Hair care was part of their ritual of strength. Ancient Scandinavians called long-haired warriors by the word skegging, which meant bearded or hairy. But behind this lay more than just appearance. In their understanding, hair was the vessel of hugur, the spirit, the inner power of a person. To lose one's hair meant to lose a part of one's soul. Imagine the smell of blood mixed with grease and the smoke of bonfires. Warriors smeared with soot comb their braids before a campaign. Their hair absorbs smoke, salt, and sweat, traces of victories that cannot be washed away. When skalds sang of heroes, they mentioned the sheen of their braids as often as the gleam of swords. According to the sagas, especially in the saga of Njal, an insult related to hair was considered a humiliation for which blood was demanded. If an enemy grabbed a Viking by the hair, it was not just a physical act, but an assault on his honor. From this arose the custom of braiding leather straps into the hair, not only for beauty, but also so that no one could grab them by their braid in battle. Hidden within this ritual of hair protection is a term known to archaeologists as fibula, a metal clasp used to secure strands. It was worn not only by women, but also by men, especially those who embarked on long campaigns. These items were found in Birka and Uppsala, Viking trading centers where the fusion of martial and religious symbolism was inseparable. But long hair had yet another meaning, a sign of freedom. Slaves and captives had their heads shaved bare. Only a free person could wear long hair. It was a living flag of his status, a mark of belonging to the world of those who wield a sword and not to those who serve. This is precisely why young men, upon becoming warriors, first let their hair grow long. From that moment on, they no longer belonged to family or land, only to the sword and the sea. Yet a question remained. If hair was a symbol of honor, why did some kings themselves order their retainers to shave it off? What compelled them to break a tradition that had been considered sacred for centuries? The answer to this lies hidden in the changing essence of Viking warfare itself, when the image of the wild beast began to give way to that of a disciplined fighter, and hair became not merely an adornment, but a marker of power and fear. As the North began to change, hair became politics. By the end of the 9th century, Viking campaigns were no longer mere raids for plunder. It was an entire system: kings, vassals, taxes, ship contingents. And it was then that long hair transformed into symbols of power and belonging to the elite. King Harald, whom chronicles call Harald Fairhair, became a living symbol of this tradition. The saga says that he swore not to cut or comb his hair until he had united all of Norway under one crown. And only after the final victory did he wash his head in sacred water and cut a lock, an act not of vanity, but of sacrifice to the gods and the land itself. Thus was born one of the era's strangest and most powerful vows, the hair oath. Warriors who took it called themselves free men of the sword. They were not permitted to cut their hair until they had completed their campaign or avenged a fallen brother. It was believed that hair absorbed anger and pain, becoming a reminder of duty. This was a vow that could not be broken without losing honor. In this ritual, a special term was used, seidr, meaning a connection between body and spirit through physical objects. Hair was considered a channel for this power, a thread between man and the gods. Shamans, who were called velur, often used strands of hair in divination rituals. They burned them as a sacrifice to Odin to learn a warrior's fate. Archaeological findings confirm this. In burials beneath Uppsala and Birka, hearths with charred hair were discovered, carefully placed next to weapons. Scholars believe these are traces of ritual cremations associated with guiding souls to Valhalla. Where a Christian would have folded his hands on his chest, a Scandinavian went to his death with a braid bound with leather as a symbol of loyalty and strength. But hair also had practical significance. In the north, where winter lasted more than half a year, long hair protected against cold, wind, and sea moisture. Warriors used animal fat to soften the strands and make them water-repellent. English chroniclers of the 9th century wrote that their hair shines as if greased with oil, and this smell can be detected from a mile away. For the Vikings themselves, this was not a flaw, but a sign of wildness and strength, a mark that they lived by the laws of the sea and war, not by the laws of civilized courts. When Scandinavian retinues began to settle in Britain and Francia, a clash of cultures became inevitable. Local warriors wore short haircuts, a symbol of discipline and submission. Vikings, however, considered short hair a sign of weakness. According to descriptions by Frankish chroniclers, warriors from the north laughed at the shorn ones, considering them slaves. Hair was a visible marker of who you were. A free man, ready to die for your name, or a soldier, obligated to obey orders. However, not all northerners adhered to the old vows. When Vikings began to serve in mercenary armies for Christian kings, they had to obey new rules. In Denmark, during the time of King Sweyn Forkbeard, there were already directives requiring retainers to cut their hair shorter so as not to interfere in formation. In battle, a long braid could become a trap. An enemy could grab it and yank the head back. Therefore, military leaders began to limit hair length, especially for foot soldiers. And yet, even then, they did not abandon the symbolism. If long hair was a sign of freedom, then short hair, styled in a particular way, became a sign of order. A new image emerged, the warrior aristocrat, with a well-groomed beard and short temples, but with a long strand at the back of the head. It was called hirdlock, from the word hird, meaning the king's retinue. This style distinguished the elite, those who had the right to stand beside the king. Thus, hair transformed into a military insignia, like a shield or a coat of arms. To lose a strand meant to lose status, to be expelled from the circle of the chosen. In the sagas of Harald Hardrada, it is said that he personally cut off the hair of a warrior who threw down his sword on the battlefield, and the warrior committed suicide from shame. This cult of hair was not merely a fashion but a system of symbols, where every strand had meaning. And yet, within these symbols, change began to ripen. When Christianity started to penetrate Scandinavia, the new god brought with him a new understanding of purity, internal, not external. It was then that long hair, for centuries considered a sign of strength, began to transform into a memory of an old world slowly sinking beneath the waves. But before they disappeared, they flared up one more time as a sign of the last resistance of the old faith. The 10th century became a time of clash of gods, old and new. The flame of pagan bonfires still smoldered, but nearby the first Christian churches were already being erected. And hair, formerly a symbol of fury and freedom, became a subject of dispute between faith and tradition. In the northern sagas of this time, the image of the shorn warrior often appears, a person who accepted the new faith but could not yet abandon the old blood. This was not just a transition of religions, it was a fracture of identity. Christian missionaries arriving from the south taught pride is a sin, and a person must be humble not only in heart, but also in appearance. In long hair, they saw a symbol of wildness, uncontrollability, the beastly origin. In some regions, especially in Denmark and the Orkney Islands, priests demanded that converts cut their hair short as a sign of submission to Christ. And archaeology confirms this. In layers from the end of the 10th century, burials of men with neatly trimmed hair and beards are increasingly found, a trace of how faith began to dictate appearance. But for warriors, this was betrayal. They believed that hair was not an adornment but a vow, a memory of ancestors. In the poems of that time, the phrase often rings, "Better to die with hair than to live without it." Even among Christian leaders, there were those who secretly preserved the old symbolism. One of them was Jarl Hakon Sigurdsson, the ruler of Norway, who officially accepted baptism but continued to offer gifts to Odin. The chronicles state that he wore long combed-back hair saturated with grease, a sign of strength that neither the church nor kings could take away. Associated with this period is also the term Drakar, a long Viking warship adorned with a carved dragon's head. The warrior's hair was often compared to its sails, the same waves, the same movement. When a Drakar went out to sea, hundreds of long-haired warriors stood on deck, and their braids swayed like living flags. For contemporaries, it was a terrifying sight. Frankish chroniclers wrote, "They are like a storm. Their hair streams and their eyes gleam like fire in the night." This very image would later become the basis for legends of the Wild Army of the North. Hair became a peculiar language of identity. By the form of the hairstyle, one could determine where a person hailed from. Warriors from Sweden often braided two plaits from Norway, one long strand tied with a leather cord. Danes preferred shorter hair, but a thick beard. These distinctions were not just fashion, they held significance on the battlefield. When ships approached the shore, enemies could tell by the appearance of the hairstyles who was coming, Swedes, Norwegians, or Danes. It was a peculiar code that every warrior knew. Chronicles note yet another striking custom, a battle ritual called blot. This was a sacrifice to the gods before a campaign, during which men sprinkled their hair with the blood of a bull or horse. It was believed that blood strengthened the spirit and gave power in battle. Hair that had absorbed blood was not washed for weeks. The smell of death was supposed to deter enemies. Archaeologists indeed found combs on which traces of blood and grease were preserved, and analysis showed it was not human blood, but animal. Gradually, Vikings began to understand. Long hair was not only a symbol, but also a means of intimidation. On the battlefield, dust, sweat, blood, everything mingled, and the warriors looked like living demons. This is precisely how monks described them in English chronicles. They are not men, but monsters with hair like snakes. This image firmly entered the consciousness of Europe and became a weapon of psychological warfare. But within Northern society itself, something more was happening. A new type of warrior emerged, professionals for whom the main thing was not fury, but discipline. They were called huskarls, the personal bodyguards of the kings. Unlike the old berserkers, these men wore neat, short hairstyles and well-groomed beards. Hair was no longer a sign of madness. Now it signified loyalty, order, and honor. And yet, even among the huskarls, one tradition remained. Before battle, they let loose one strand, which they did not touch as long as they lived. This strand was called the thread of fate. It was cut only after the warrior's death. Thus, hair became a bridge between the old and new faith, between fury and discipline. In them lived the memory of ancient gods, but the cold of Christian iron was already felt. The North was preparing for a new era, an era when long hair would cease to be a weapon, but would remain a sign of an unconquered spirit. And yet, one more generation had to prove that the Viking's strength lived not in his sword, but in what he wore on his head, like a crown of his own pride. The beginning of the 11th century became the time when the hair of the Northerners definitively transformed into a sign of power, status, and memory. The old symbolism did not disappear. It changed its appearance. Now long hair was worn not by savages and berserkers, but by kings and jarls, turning an ancient vow into a mark of nobility. It was at this time that descriptions emerged of kings and noble warriors beginning to braid their hair into intricate patterns, weaving in silver threads, feathers, and amulets. Archaeologists found ornaments in Gotland burials that were previously thought to be female, but are now linked to male hairstyles. Hair became a canvas on which the history of the lineage was written. The historian Adam of Bremen wrote about Vikings who arrived in Germany. They are well-groomed. Their hair is washed and fragrant, as if with myrrh. This contrast was striking. Those who were recently feared as savages now astonished with their cleanliness and neatness. But behind this outward change lay the same ancient cult of strength. In the northern sagas, it was said that a man was obliged to be neat and fearsome at the same time. Hair became a way to command respect, not for wildness, but for dignity. At this time, a new term appeared, drotten, meaning lord, head of the retinue. His hair was considered sacred because, according to the warrior's belief, Lad flowed through it, the grace, the ruler's energy, binding people together. A king who cut his hair lost the symbolic right to lead an army. Therefore, when Olaf the Saint accepted baptism, he retained his long hair. This caused disputes among priests, but strengthened his power among the people. The chronicles note that Olaf's retainers wore shoulder-length hair, carefully combed it before battle, and greased it with fat. This was a ritual of concentration, a reminder of old times. According to archaeologists' observations, combs found in the 11th century layers become increasingly elegant, crafted from bone, amber, and silver. This indicates that hair care became an element of culture, not just superstition. But among common warriors, the cult of hair still lived its own harsher life. When a ship set out on a raid, men took an oath not to cut their hair until they returned home with plunder. This vow was called the Holy Braid. Its violation was considered not just weakness, but a crime against the entire retinue. There is a known case where a warrior who cut his hair due to heat on the journey was thrown overboard, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of a curse. The symbolism of hair also manifested in burial rituals. When a jarl died, his wife, or a female slave, was forced to cut a strand of hair and place it in the grave. This was the last connection between the living and the dead. The saga of Gisli describes how the hero's widow, before burning her husband's body, cut off her own braid and threw it into the fire with the words, "May my spirit follow his strength." Scientists researching burials of that period indeed found women's hair in urns with warriors' ashes, direct confirmation of this custom. In cities where Vikings began to mingle with the peoples of Europe, hair became a sign of origin. Scandinavians were distinguished by it, like a passport. In 11th century London, where mercenaries from the north settled, they were dubbed long-haired northerners. Local residents even coined a saying, "If you see a man with hair like a flax field, do not argue with him. He is from the sea." Hair became a metaphor for the strength and fear that the descendants of Vikings still evoked. Over time, the image of the long-haired northerner began to enter legends. Skalds told that every hair on a warrior's head was a thread of fate, woven by the Norns, goddesses of destiny. From this arose the custom of not combing one's hair before battle, so as not to tangle fate. Some modern scholars see in this a reflection of ancient totemism. Hair was perceived as an extension of the soul. However, with the growth of Christian power, attitudes towards it began to change. New monasteries taught Scandinavians humility and neatness, and long hair was increasingly associated with pride. At the Council of Lund at the end of the 11th century, bishops directly condemned the warrior's habit of wearing shoulder-length hair. They demanded short haircuts in the name of purity and order. But the more the church forbade, the more fiercely the Northerners clung to their ancient symbolism. Hair became a form of resistance, a quiet defiance. When missionaries cut the hair of young warriors, they secretly let the strands grow again. And even among priests, there were those who secretly continued to believe in their power. An Icelandic chronicle preserves a record. The old monk before dying said, "Do not touch the hair until the spirit leaves the body, for memory lives there." This phrase perhaps best reflects the Northerners' attitude towards hair in that era, not as an adornment, but as a living part of the person himself. And yet, a new sun was already rising over Scandinavia. Old beliefs faded, berserkers disappeared, and psalms replaced the songs of skalds. But hair, these silent witnesses of change, preserved what neither sword nor cross could destroy: the belief that a person's strength begins not with weapons, but with what they carry upon themselves, as a banner. By the mid-11th century, the Viking world was no longer what their ancestors had known. Trade replaced plunder. Christian churches supplanted Odin's shrines, and it seemed that the Old North was fading. But it was then that the long hair of the Vikings acquired new meaning. It became a symbol of the memory of freedom. Warriors who still remembered the ancient vows wore them not for fashion, and not for the gods, but so as not to forget who they were. The chronicles of that time tell of an army assembled by King Canute the Great, the very one who ruled not only Denmark and Norway, but also England. His retinue consisted of the best warriors of the north, and almost all of them wore long hair, despite the priest's commands. English monks wrote with condemnation, "They keep their hair long like lions and pride themselves on it as a weapon." And this was no exaggeration. Hair still remained a sign of belonging to the warrior brotherhood, a reminder that their world was built not on prayer, but on swords. A special role was played by the huskarls, the king's personal guard. Unlike ordinary soldiers, they preserved elements of old symbolism, braiding one strand at the back of the head and tying it with a silver thread. This strand was called konung's hár, the king's hair. It was believed that as long as it was intact, the warrior was bound by an oath of loyalty to the ruler. Archaeologists found silver ribbons with engraved runes that could have been used precisely for this ritual. It was an invisible thread between the ancient pagan world and the new monarchy. But not everyone accepted this new discipline. In the northern lands, on the outskirts of Norway and Iceland, there still lived people who called themselves old believers of the sword. They rejected the church and kings, but sacredly preserved old traditions, including the cult of hair. According to Icelandic sagas, such people cut their hair only in two cases: when they lost honor or when they themselves wished to depart from life. For them, hair was not just a part of the body, but the last proof of freedom. One of the last to embody this ancient vow was Harald Hardrada, the very king who died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Contemporaries wrote that his hair was so long that it had to be braided into 3 plaits. Before the last battle, he ordered his warriors to unbind their hair so that the north wind would pass through it like the breath of the gods. When he fell, his body was identified precisely by his hair, woven with a golden ribbon, a symbol that even death cannot deprive a person of strength if they keep their oath. The term used then to denote long-haired warriors was langhar, from Old Norse for long-haired. It already sounded almost like a nickname from a bygone era. In the songs of the skalds, the longhars were mentioned as the last children of the sea. Their hair was compared to the paths of ships, and the strands to the waves on which souls depart. One Icelandic poem states, "When the sea calls, a warrior's hair stands up like sails." Interestingly, even among the peoples conquered by the Vikings, traces of respect for this tradition were preserved. In the English epic Beowulf, recorded after Christianization, the hero is described as a warrior with hair that shines like steel. Scholars believe that this image arose under the influence of the Northerners. Hair became a metaphor for valor that could not be washed away by blood or time. When the old retinues disbanded and their descendants became landowners, long hair became a legacy. Now it was not a sign of war, but a family symbol. In some Scandinavian families, there was a custom of keeping a lock of an ancestor's hair in a wooden casket, a minne. This was a kind of relic, a confirmation of origin. Such caskets are found even today in old burial mounds. Inside lie braided locks, tied with copper wire. Gradually, in people's minds, hair became not a weapon, but a memory in which pride still lived. Even centuries later, when the Vikings were gone, their image persisted through the long hair of northern warriors, Swedish peasants, Norwegian sailors, Icelandic skalds. Hair became a quiet reminder of a world where honor was worth life and strength was measured not by the amount of land, but by the length of the strand you earned with blood. However, this symbol underwent yet another transformation. In late medieval chronicles, one can read how monks already condemned long hair as a trace of barbarism, but it was precisely this contempt that allowed the memory to survive. Everything forbidden lives longer. People still told stories of warriors who allowed no one to touch their heads, even before death. They said that as long as the hair was intact, the spirit was unconquered. Thus the old vow, once uttered amidst the roar of the storm and the clang of swords, transformed into a cultural legend. Hair became the last bridge between epochs, between the sea and the cross, between freedom and law. And although the world changed, its meaning remained the same. The Viking's strength does not die. It merely hides beneath the skin, like a memory braided into a plate. When the northern storms subsided and the swords had long rusted, the legend of the long-haired warriors did not disappear. It survived centuries, changing along with those who remembered the taste of salt and iron. For the descendants of Vikings, hair became not merely an adornment, but a symbol that a person should not bow their head to either gods or fear. Even in the 13th century, when Scandinavia already lived by the laws of the church, sagas continued to say, "A warrior's fate sleeps in his hair." Archaeologists researching ancient burials found remnants of combs, scissors, amulets, items that accompanied northerners from birth to death. In them lived the memory of a time when every touch to hair was a ritual. Scholars believe that long hair helped the Vikings not only stay warm, but also survive in another sense, as a people capable of remembering their past. For as long as you remember who you are alive. Historians debate why exactly hair became sacred to them. Some speak of practicality, others of symbolism, but the truth is likely somewhere in between. A Viking's hair was like his sword, a part of his body, a part of his honor, a part of his soul. To lose it meant to lose oneself. And when, in Christian Europe, a short haircut became a symbol of humility, the long hair of the Northerners reminded them that there was another strength, the strength of inner freedom. It requires no altars, needs no blessing. It lives within a person, like the breath of the sea in their chest. Today, 1,000 years later, the image of the Viking with long hair still lives on, in films, in books, in our collective memory. But behind this image stands more than just appearance. It is a challenge. It is a memory of a time when a person did not ask permission to be themselves. And now, knowing why Vikings wore long hair, ask yourself, if strength is not a sword, but the spirit living within, then what today is your braid, your sign of freedom, which you will never allow to be cut?